Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for our 9th Learn From Home Live. My name is Rose, and I am the Marketing and PR Coordinator here at Ocean Sonics. And I'm joined today by Dan Hasselman, the Science Director at Fundy Ocean Research Center for Energy, commonly known as FORCE. Hi, Dan.
Hi there. How are you?
Lovely, thanks. I'm so happy you could join us here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I know this is going to be a really interesting topic for a lot of the people who have tuned in for our live sessions previously. So I'm really excited to get on with it. And for those of you who have joined us on our previous sessions, you'll know that we regularly hold staff learning sessions at our office. And this is where our teammates share our expertise with the rest of our crew. And now, because many of us, and not just Ocean Sonics, are working from home, we wanted to share these learning sessions with you. So we are going to be doing these live social media sessions regularly, so keep your eyes on our social channels, and we'll share all the details such as upcoming topics and sessions on our social feeds. And if you missed any of our previous presentations, don't worry, you can find them all online. We record all of them, and they live on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page, so you can visit or revisit them anytime you'd like. Today's session is also going to be recorded and shared online, so don't worry if you missed something and want to watch it again. So for everyone joining that's unfamiliar with Ocean Sonics, we are an ocean acoustics company. We're based in Truro, Nova Scotia on the east coast of Canada. And we created the IC Listen, and this is a real-time smart hydrophone. So it's a tool that processes data in real time so you can actively listen while the sensor is deployed. And today we're going to talk a little bit about renewable energies. It's a hot topic these days as we try to move towards more sustainable energy sources. In Eastern Canada, we have the highest tides in the world in the Bay of Fundy, so tidal energy often comes to mind when we think of renewables. It's important to monitor and ensure we are doing best by our environments, and this is where FORCE comes in. FORCE is Canada's lead research facility for tidal stream technology, and it was created to better understand if this technology can play a safe, effective role in Canada's future energy future. So FORCE is a private not-for-profit company operated by staff, governed by a board of directors, and guided by input from an independent environmental monitoring advisory committee and a community liaison committee. So Dan is their science director, and he's going to be leading today's session. He's going to introduce their acoustic monitoring efforts, and he's going to focus in particular on listening to Harbour Porpoises in the Minas Passage. So again, thanks for joining us today, Dan. Can you tell us a little bit more about FORCE and your acoustic programming?
Yeah, certainly. Well, first of all, Rose, thanks very much for that excellent introduction. You really provided a really great synopsis of FORCE. FORCE is right. We're a nonprofit organization. We've been conducting monitoring activities in the Minas Passage for several years now, using a combination of both passive and active acoustic monitoring devices, as well as other complementary technologies. Monitoring under the water can be difficult. Things are often out of sight under the waves, but that doesn't mean that they're out of mind. And so a lot of our monitoring activities, especially for Harbour Porpoise, focus on listening for things.
Well, that sounds fantastic. So for everyone watching, after Dan finishes his presentation, we are going to have a Q&A session. And if you want to know some more detail about anything that we cover today, you can just leave us a comment on one of our live streams. We are monitoring them, and we'll do our best to answer them live after the presentation. So now I'm going to share Dan's screen, and we're going to hop right into the presentation. All right, take it away, Dan.
All right, well, great. Thank you very much, Rose. So am I correct? You can see my full screen there with the full presentation, not the side view?
Yes, looks fantastic. And I see a little porpoise hanging out.
Oh, good, good, excellent. Yeah. All right, well, great. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining me today. This is a great opportunity for me to share some of FORCE's ongoing monitoring efforts using passive acoustic monitoring in the Bay of Fundy and Minas Passage, as well as some of the ongoing research efforts we're taking to help advance our understanding of how we should be monitoring for Harbour Porpoise in the future. So today's presentation I've broken it into two components. The first is basically a bit of an introduction by providing an overview of FORCE, talk a bit about the Minas Passage and the complexities of working in such a tidally dynamic environment. And I'll provide a bit of a primer about PAM technologies in particular and what's available for monitoring Harbour Porpoise. And from there, I'll talk about three series of activities that FORCE has been engaged in for monitoring Harbour Porpoise. This includes an overview of our environmental effects monitoring program, which has been ongoing at FORCE since 2011. A recent study we completed about comparing how these different technologies perform in high flow environments, and then moving onwards to a future study, which is going to help identify where we should be putting passive acoustic monitoring instruments for most effective monitoring of Harbour porpoise. So as Rose mentioned, FORCE is a nonprofit that was established in 2009 to serve as a hub for in-stream tidal power research and development, as well as to help determine whether or not in-stream tidal power can be a part of Canada's marine renewable energy future. And today's FORCE is Canada's leading research center for the demonstration of in-stream tidal energy technology. And we fulfill our mandate through two concurrent roles. First, we serve as host to tidal stream developers by providing a suite of onshore and offshore infrastructure to assist in assessment of tidal energy technologies, as well as to help provide that power to the Nova Scotia grid. And secondly, we serve an important environmental stewardship role by conducting a series of environmental monitoring programs for fish, marine mammals, lobsters, and seabirds, as well as marine noise and ongoing ocean science projects. We also have a series of ongoing research projects that are continuing, as well as a series of engagement activities, including today's webinar, to help share the results from our monitoring and activities with the general public. So the Minas Passage is a dynamic marine environment. It's a tremendous tidal amplitude, 14 meters up and down on a tidal cycle. Tremendous amount of water, 14 billion tons, moves through the site on a given tide. And tidal speeds can reach up to 20 kilometers an hour. Now, that might not sound like a lot if you're driving in your car, but if you're on a vessel on the Minas Passage and you're moving along, I can tell you it's quite something. Now, that video there shows us moving as what you might think of at a pretty good clip. But as you pan to the left and you see Black Rock, a feature at our site, you realize, holy cow, we're just barely holding station. And that speaks to the power of the Minas Passage and the amount of water that's coming in and out of the Bay of Fundy and Minas Basin. When you have that amount of power, it generates a tremendous amount of complexity for the physical environment. There's a lot of turbulent flow in the area. There are vortices and eddies, whirlpools, wakes, and shear currents, all of which have implications for our monitoring programs. So hopefully you can see my mouse over here on the map. During an ebbing tide, the Cape Sharp headland generates these vortices that are fairly large in size, and they propagate a fair distance along the shoreline out Minas Passage and right past the FORCE site. And these vortices can entrain air, in some cases right down to the seabed. And you know, it's not a shallow area. We're talking in places 100 feet deep. And that can really interfere with acoustic signal detection, especially when it comes to scattering the signals that we're looking to detect. So why might we use passive acoustic monitoring devices? Well, this is particularly useful when we're looking at characterizing sound, but also for monitoring echolocating marine mammals like Harbour porpoise that are interested in finding food, etc., and using their natural capabilities. The challenge here is that marine renewable energy devices could generate sounds that affect marine mammal navigation, communication, predation, and life cycles. So it's important to understand the activities of Harbour porpoise around tidal power, whether or not the distributions are being altered by activities, etc. Now I'm going to switch out for a second here and show you something. Let's see if this will work. Go over here to this here. Rose, can you confirm you're seeing this? Just want to make sure.
Yes, we've got a big, beautiful spectrogram on the screen. Okay,
great. So as I mentioned before, you know, we're listening for things, but it's important to, I think, convey how sound can be visualized and how we can detect Harbour porpoise. So this is from a prey capture study conducted by Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute a number of years ago. I'm just going to press the play button here, and what you're going to hear is a Harbour porpoise clicking away, looking for food, and as it narrows in on a prey item, it's going to increase the frequency of its clicking, going to capture that prey, and then it's going to go back down to its sort of pattern of looking onwards. Oops, let's try that again.
Dan, can you say that again a little louder? I can hear the beginnings of it.
Yeah, I'm going to do that again. Let me crank up the volume here. But I think it's important to see this. And this is what we're looking for in the mic. How was that, Rose?
That was fantastic. That was a treat to hear, for sure.
Okay, good. So let's go back then to the presentation. And we were down here. And from current slide. Are we back?
Yep.
Okay, good. We'll move on. So, so that's why we might use PAM to help detect Harbour porpoise in the Minas Passage. Now, there are a variety of factors that can influence the detection efficiency of PAM instruments. These include things like the natural ambient sound of the environment that you're monitoring in. Minas Passage is a noisy place. There's a lot of sediment moving around, and so it's it can be a bit of a challenge. Also important is the size of the hydrophone you're using and geometry, as well as how you deploy that instrument, whether it's from a floating configuration or if it's moored on the bottom, either through a mooring chain or if it's on a stable platform. But of all the factors that can influence detection efficiency, flow noise is arguably the most important. And this is generated from pressure fluctuations, from turbulent flow across the surface of the hydrophone that can mask the sounds that we're interested in detecting across a fairly large bandwidth. So the spectrogram on the lower right basically shows the frequency and the spectral density of the flow noise at the force site during an ebb and a flood tide. And as you can see, we get a lot of flow noise here highlighted in red on both ebbing and flood tide cycles. And this can influence the detection range for the marine mammals we're interested in monitoring. So let's talk a bit now about the different commercially available PAM instruments that are available for monitoring Harbour porpoise. There's generally two classes. There's conventional instruments that require separate hardware for recording clicks and then software for signal detection and classification. And these are things like the Ocean Sonics IC Listen, Sound Trap from Ocean Instruments, as well as AMAR. And these types of instruments, they record the raw pressure time series that permits analysis of individual clicks, and that's really beneficial. The other classification, the other class of instrument is standalone instruments. These are things like the Chelonia SeaPod and FPod. These allow the pressure time series to be analyzed in real time, and that sounds great. What it does is it collects the data, it will discard the raw data while retaining the metadata. But the challenge there is that it only records click trains. You need a minimum number of clicks in a row for it to be classified as a click train and then stored by the instrument. And so that's a bit of a setback in terms of examining all the data that's available out there. And these instruments can be deployed in a variety of different configurations. We can have them underneath drifting floats. We can have them moored, bottom mounted, or even mounted to the support structure for a tidal energy device. Now for standalone instruments, you'll see I put an asterisk there, and I wanted to come back to this. For standalone instruments, it has a detection buffer embedded into its software, and that limits the amount of detections that can be recorded per minute. If you've got a moored standalone instrument, it can, the flow noise can saturate that detection buffer, generating lost time, which means after it's recorded as much as it can, it stops. And that's it for that particular minute of recording. And then ultimately that can lead to underreporting of what's actually taking place. So that's something to bear in mind when you're considering PAM instruments. So that's basically the first part of the talk, a bit of a background, talk a bit about Minas Passage and then what's available. I'm now going to talk about how FORCE has been using passive acoustic monitoring instruments for Harbour porpoise monitoring in Minas Passage, as well as a series of studies we've embarked on recently and moving forward to help advance our abilities to detect Harbour porpoise. So Force has an environmental effects monitoring program for Harbour Porpoise that's been in place since 2011. And the objective here is to determine whether or not operational turbines alter Harbour Porpoise distribution and activity at the Force site. So the picture at the top here, you'll see a yellow subs buoy, a streamlined underwater buoyancy system. In it, we have a SeaPod, which is one of the standalone instruments I mentioned just a few moments ago. And then it's moored to the bottom on using a 500-pound anchor chain. We have 5 sites scattered in and around the Force site where we deploy these sub-buoys with the SeaPods. E1, D1, W1, W2, and then in deeper water, S2. 2 of them are deployed within close proximity of the non-operational open hydro turbine. We've been collecting baseline data for from SeaPods since 2011, and during the turbine operations in 2016 and 17 for 130 days, we had data collection at that point as well. Overall, across the 5 SeaPods, we've got over 6,500 monitoring days using this configuration. Here are some results from both the baseline and the testing of effects when the turbine was deployed in 2016, 2017. Basically, we see Harbour Porpoise present around the Force site on a nearly continuous basis. They're present on 98.8% of SeaPod days. For baseline data, we get a higher click detection rate during both spring and fall. So you can see, for instance, here, right around this time of year, we get a peak of Harbour Porpoise activity at the Force site, and then again in early November. And this is likely consistent with the movement of prey through the Force site, the herring runs, etc. We also see a higher proportion of click detections at night, during low flows on an ebbing tide, as well as during high tide periods, during higher tidal heights. When we analyze the data for the SeaPods collected when the open hydro turbine was operational in 2016, 2017, we found no permanent avoidance of the Force site when the turbine was being installed or during its operation. There was a temporary movement of Harbour Porpoise away from the Force site when all the vessels were there deploying and installing the turbine, but after they left, the Harbour Porpoise came back to the Force site. Interestingly enough, we did see a significant reduction in the activity for the SeaPods that are located near the open hydro turbine. So let's go back one. So here's the turbine deployed here in 2016, 2017. And when that was operational, we saw a reduced activity for E1 and D1 that might suggest some active avoidance behavior by Harbour Porpoise in response to operational turbines. So that's interesting to note. Now, there are a couple of important limitations for SeaPods that need to be borne in mind when thinking about results. First of all, the detection range for this technology decreases with flow noise. As I mentioned before, flow noise is a real problem for PAM devices. As well, across the 5 SeaPods we deploy, we saw a mean 22.3% of lost time associated with flow rates, basically. And this proportion of mean time goes up to 65% if flow velocities exceed basically 3 meters per second. So the high flows at the Force site present a challenge for monitoring using SeaPods. So here are some takeaways from our EEMP. Because of the lost time that we encounter because of flow noise, the SeaPod data provides a minimum estimate of porpoise activity at the Force site. And we need to continue monitoring using this technology because we need a longer time series to really quantify the variability of Harbour Porpoise detections at Force and for understanding the effects of turbines on their distribution in the area. There are a number of disadvantages and advantages for SeaPods. From a disadvantage point of view, the onboard processing algorithm is a bit of a black box for detecting and classifying Harbour Porpoise. Buffer saturation from flow noise can lead to lost time and underreporting of Harbour Porpoise at the Force site. On the flip side, SeaPods are pretty affordable cost-wise. They can be extended for, they can be deployed for extended periods of time We conduct year-round monitoring using SeaPods, and they're deployed basically 3 months at a time. And the standardized detection methodology in the device helps to control for false positive detections. And that's actually an important feature. You don't want your signals to be dominated by false detections. Okay, so let's switch gears now and talk about another aspect of Force's activities. And this is an ongoing effort to advance our abilities to monitor Harbour porpoise. We recently conducted a comparative passive acoustic monitoring device assessment at the Force site, recognizing that the SeaPod limitations were necessitated basically a critical assessment of other PAM technologies and whether or not they're better suited for monitoring in high flow environments. And so the objective here was basically to understand the operational limitations of 5 off-the-shelf technologies at Force. Here we had the SeaPod, Chelonia dedicated an F-pod, which is a new version of the SeaPod for us. So thanks Chelonia for that. We used a sound trap by Ocean Instruments, an IC Listen high-frequency hydrophone that we already purchased, and then from Ocean Sonics, of course, and then an AMR G4. So thanks Jasco for those as well. The first thing we did was to go to a controlled environment, the Dalhousie Aquatron facility in the pool tank, in order to do an acoustic time synchronization using synthetic Harbour porpoise clicks, just to make sure that all of these PAM instruments were functioning as intended. So here we've deployed each of the 5 PAM instruments below a buoy in the pool tank, and then one of our courageous staff members paddled out to the center on a floating dock, deployed an IC talk, which is a synthetic Harbour porpoise click emitter, basically, and played signals basically to those instruments. We got the data back. We sent it off to our to SMRU for analysis, and they confirmed that each of the PAM instruments was functioning as intended. After which we mounted them all to one of Force's fast platforms and deployed it at the Force site. We then conducted a series of passive drifts over the platform with the IC talk across a range of tidal conditions to understand flow rates at which different instruments no longer function as well as what we might think. We recorded our vessel tracks using a handheld GPS. Flow information was provided by an acoustic Doppler current profiler, which was mounted on the Cape Sharp turbine deployed in berth D. And then the data that was collected from the platform was ground truthed with SeaPod data that was deployed at location D1 as part of Force's ongoing EEMP. The data was downloaded and passed on to SMRU in Vancouver for analysis. They conducted standard quality control assessment for things like start and stop times for the IC talk, as well as a series of click annotation steps. They used PAMGuard for click detection and classification, and had to set the threshold for detection at a fairly high level, 6 decibels. And this was required because the IC talk is a fairly low source level for synthetic Harbour porpoise clicks. It's not as strong as a real Harbour porpoise. And so we just had to set it that way in order to conduct the study. They also went ahead and recorded the number of true positive detections as well as false positive and false negative detections. And then we compared the PAM instrument accuracy by calculating an equally weighted F-score to account for both precision and recall. So the plot on the on the right is a series is from one drift on September 15th, and I'll walk you through that. Overall, we had 52 drifts and a total of just over 11,600 clicks from the IC talk. The top panel here basically shows you the current over the course of that drift. It shows you how far the vessel was from the platform during that drift. It shows you during that time the clicks emitted by the IC talk, and then how each of the AMR, sound trap, and the IC listen performed in detecting those synthetic Harbour porpoise clicks. Now, it's important to to note that neither the SeaPod or the FPod are listed here, and that's because the IC talk didn't emit clicks that were registered by those devices as click trains. So that's an important caveat here. So I'll walk you through this a little bit. So for this particular drift, you can see that where we start the drift at around 80 meters away, and we get closer and closer and closer, and then we're basically over top of the platform, or as close as we are in this particular drift, around 15 to 20 meters away, and then we start to drift away. And during that drift, you can see these are the blocks of IC talk synthetic Harbour Porpoise clicks that were played. And then for here, you'll see for the AMR, these are the clicks that were detected. And then again, for the sound trap and for the IC listen. Interesting to note that when we aren't playing synthetic Harbour Porpoise clicks, you get some false positive detections. You get them for the AMR, the sound trap, and the IC listen on both ends, basically. So here are some general findings from playing the synthetic clicks. Detections basically increased as the IC talk drifted away from the platform as opposed to towards it. True positive detections were more likely at current velocities less than 1.7 meters per second, and the detection rate drops rapidly above 2 meters per second. The IC listen had the highest recall, the highest precision, and the greatest F-score. And that's not surprising because the F-score is generated from both the recall and the precision. And it also had the greatest mean detection range of about 44 meters. Now that's not a great distance, but again, that's linked to the source level of the IC talk. Real Harbour Porpoise would be detected from a greater distance. Interesting to note that the IC listen had consistently lower sound pressure levels during the high flow. Basically what that means is that the IC listen was less sensitive to flow noise and had a greater signal to noise ratio. Now, when we transition and look at the detection of the real Harbour Porpoise at the Force site, basically there were nearly 18,000 clicks that were detected from real Harbour Porpoise, and those were combined in 281 click trains. All the PAM instruments were able to detect these Harbour Porpoise clicks. However, the conventional instruments, so the sound trap, the AMR, and the IC listen, had elevated levels of false positive detections that created that was necessary to do additional post-processing to kind of weed those out. One thing we've identified is that reducing the sensitivity of the click detector, so reducing from 6 decibels down to something more reasonable, decreases the false positive rate. And that suggests that advancing the use of conventional hydrophones in high flow environments is probably best done by developing a better click detector and classifier that can reduce false positive detections while keeping the recall high. So some takeaways from the comparative PAM study are that the IC listen performed well for monitoring Harbour Porpoise in high flows, and that a better click detector and classifier is needed to deal with the false positive detections. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the final component here, and that's identifying where we should be putting hydrophones for monitoring tidal turbines going forward. So as I mentioned towards the beginning of the talk, the efficacy of PAM instruments is influenced by signal scattering due to turbulence and entrained air. So what we really need to know is how well does a PAM instrument perform if deployed at the surface for monitoring versus if it's deployed at the bottom. So we've been fortunate to link up with Sustainable Marine Energies Canada. They've been a great collaborator on this project. They currently have their Platt-Eye floating tidal energy platform that's shown here, deployed in Grand Passage, Nova Scotia. This is where we're doing these tests. And this is also an important component of the Pathway program, which is a joint initiative between Force and the Offshore Energy Research Association of Nova Scotia. And if you want to learn more about the Pathway program, there's an overview webinar provided at the link below. I encourage you to go check that out. Basically, the plan here is to deploy an IC listen, both on one of our fast platforms on the seabed in Grand Passage, and also to have one pole mounted on the Platt-Eye, and then to conduct a series of passive drifts using the IC talk like we did in the previous study. And this should hopefully tell us whether or not that signal is picked up just as efficiently in bottom and surface deployments, or if entrained air and turbulence at the surface makes surface deployments of IC listens and other PAM instruments non-advisable. So thinking about all the activity that Force has been involved in, our EEMP since 2011, our ongoing efforts to advance PAM, the conclusions really are the choice of PAM technology and how you deploy it largely depends on what questions you're trying to address, so your monitoring goals, the environment that you're trying to conduct the monitoring in, as well as your budget. If you had unlimited funds, the ideal situation would be to deploy a conventional hydrophone that can record data continuously and that you can then subject to a variety of different click detectors and classifiers for filtering out flow noise and identifying the signals you're interested in. However, that can be really cost prohibitive, especially from a human resources and analysis point of view. You can deploy hydrophones in a stationary configuration, but you need to be aware of flow noise and how that impacts detection efficiency. And you can also deploy these things underneath floats with isolation mechanisms to remove flow noise, things like drogues and catenary sections to mitigate flow noise, but none of these solutions is 100% effective. Now, floating, drifting hydrophones are valuable for understanding spatial distributions of animals, but they're also fairly labor intensive. You can't just deploy it and watch it sail away. You've got to have somebody tracking this thing and repositioning it as you need to keep your monitoring efforts ongoing. So lots of people to thank over the years for the contributions towards the research we conduct. Obviously, Ocean Sonics, a big thank you to you for hosting this live session, as well as for providing us with the IC talk. Chelonia for providing the FPOD we incorporated into the comparative PAM study. JASCO for the AMR, SMRU for analysis. Our staff at Force, who are always keen to play a supportive role in engaging in these efforts. SMEC for their ongoing help. As well as Huntley's, Sub-Aqua Construction, OERA and the Pathway Program, and Fisheries and Oceans Canada and Nova Scotia Environment. And so with that, happy to take any questions you may have.
Fantastic. That was a really great presentation. I feel like I know so much more about the Minas Passage and Harbour Porpoises now. I just want to remind everyone, if you do have a question for Dan, just leave it on one of our social feeds. We are watching them right now. So if you do have a question, drop us a line and we'll do our best to answer them live. So I have a few questions. At the beginning, we were speaking about passive and active acoustic monitoring or acoustics. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference between passive and active acoustics and maybe
sure.
examples of some passive and active?
Yep, right. So passive acoustic instruments are primarily intended for listening to what's out there in the environment, whether that be ambient noise from sediment transport or vessels transferring through an area or harbor porpoise, versus active acoustic devices, which involve sending out sound signals from a transducer and then receiving them back as they bounce off of things out there. So we use active acoustics primarily for our mobile fish hydroacoustic surveys, for understanding density and distribution of different fish at the Force site. As well, another example would be multi-beam imaging sonars, which are things like a Tritech Gemini imaging sonar or a Blue View imaging sonar, which are valuable for detecting various targets at different ranges.
So I know you have a number of monitoring stations. How many do you have, and how do you decide where they're going to be installed?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we have 5 SeaPods routinely deployed at the Force site, and the configuration was ultimately decided on based on consultation with SMRU, who's been engaged in our monitoring program since the beginning. They help determine whether or not a location makes sense based on our monitoring goals. We have shifted a couple over the years. We started with 8, we're down to 5. And that was because some SeaPods simply weren't recording data that was relevant. We had to prioritize where we put our devices. There are other things that we do. So we have our FAST platform, as I mentioned. This is deployed based on different research projects we're engaged in. Our mobile hydroacoustic fish surveys, which occur on a regular basis. Yeah. Force website will provide all kinds of information for you, for sure.
So you've spoken at length about SeaPods and hydrophones. Can you let us know what the distinct differences are between the two tools?
Between the SeaPods and
hydrophone?
So this comes basically back to the two classes of instruments, whether or not you've got a conventional instrument that can record the raw pressure time series in wave files and allow you to dig deep into the data and look at individual clicks, or standalone instruments which have onboard processing and allow you to discard the raw data, retain the metadata, but then it limits you to analyzing click trains. So you need a certain number of clicks in a row for the instrument to register it, basically as a hit. So that's a bit of a trade-off there.
How is a click train determined? Is it through the amount of clicks, the strength of the clicks?
So it's a good question. I'm not an expert in that in particular. My understanding is that you need 4 clicks in a row in rapid succession in order for it to be retained as a click train by a CPOD and FPOD.
So I know you mentioned you've been monitoring since 2011.
Yeah.
And you did mention that you've adjusted your monitoring program depending on the relevancy of your data. But how has your approach to collecting ocean sound data changed since you first began monitoring, and why did you make those changes?
That's a great question. Our environmental effects monitoring program is based in adaptive management. We listen to stakeholders, we listen to regulators, and we incorporate the lessons learned from our previous analysis and field activities to help guide how we can better conduct monitoring at the force site. And so we're always looking for new ways to do things, focusing in on successes and incorporating lessons learned into how we conduct monitoring going forward, as well as to guiding how we design studies that are going to help advance our monitoring capabilities at the force site.
So we have an interesting question from our Facebook feed right now from Gisela. And Dan, perhaps you don't know the exact answer to this, but maybe you can hypothesize. Gisela works with Franciscana dolphin in Argentina, and she was wondering, do you think that perhaps the sea or the FPODs could be programmed to detect these specific marine mammals?
So I'm not a, excuse me, I'm not a marine mammal expert by nature. My background's fish. So I'm standing in. I think so. It's best to talk with those who have far more experience monitoring dolphins and porpoises than myself. It's partly going to depend on the environment that you're monitoring. And if you've got an incredibly high flow environment, you may find that lost time is a factor for conventional, or pardon me, standalone instruments. Perhaps conventional instruments might be better. But again, it comes down to your monitoring questions, your environment, and your budget.
Of course, budgets are always so important.
They sure are.
Yeah. So speaking of high flow environments, I know the Bay of Fundy it's a very high flow environment. How do you work around such significant flow noise? And do you have any methodologies, tips, or tricks for people working in similar environments?
Yeah, so we target deployments and retrievals during periods of slack water. Now, because it's a lot of volume moving through, those periods of slack water are fairly narrow. But in terms of staff safety and making sure that we're doing things in a way that is consistent with safety, we target slack water periods to do those kinds of things. You're right, it's a challenging environment, both from a data collection point of view, but also an operational point of view. Deploying and retrieving instruments, it's a challenge. But we've been doing this long enough now. We've got a good handle on how to deal with these situations.
So what if anything, has surprised you most over the course of your acoustic monitoring program? Be it having to work with such a difficult environment, or something that you see in your data that you find unexpected?
I think the thing that surprised me most was just how noisy the environment is. You know, cobbles and rocks and stones are almost continually being moved around by these high flows, and they click when they hit each other, and the amount of noise that's produced is a real challenge for filtering out true signals from confounding factors. I think another surprising thing was just how prevalent Harbour porpoise are at the force site. I mean, we see them on 98.8% of SeaPod monitoring days. And so they are a dominant biological feature at our site, and requires ongoing monitoring.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the noise, because we often we think so much about anthropogenic noise, you know, from vessels and construction and installment, that we forget how noisy nature can be all on its own.
Yeah,
the Bay of Fundy is a perfect example. So you touched on this earlier, but how do you manage the different stakeholders within the monitoring program, within FORCE? And does that affect how you determine what you monitor and who's responsible for data?
So stakeholders obviously and rights holders are an incredibly important component of FORCE and our engagement activities. We incorporate feedback from stakeholders into our monitoring programs. We are fortunate to have independent science review of our monitoring by our Environmental Monitoring Advisory Committee, as well as ongoing consultation with our Community Liaison Committee. So engagement with those groups, as well as stakeholders at large, helps to guide how we do things. At the same time, though, like I mentioned, we do focus in on what we are mandated to monitor, and using the best scientific techniques and tools available to us to do these things.
So that actually leads really well into my last question for you. And this one, you can approach it as a bit more of a pie in the sky kind of question, and we'll forget about budgets. But what do you hope to see in the coming years for your acoustic programming?
I would love to see us get to a point where we can deploy instruments, get data returned to us in real time. That gives us immediate information about presence, location, how often we see Harbour porpoise, and how many. That's a lofty goal. That is something. That is something that is being worked on globally. A variety of different entities are interested in getting to that point, and I'm proud to say that FORCE is contributing to that by engagement in the Pathway program, as well as our engagement with OES Environmental and the State of the Science reports.
Well, thank you so much. Those are all the questions that I have for right now. Again, if there was a question that you didn't get to ask Dan, or if there's a topic that you'd like to see covered during this web series, please don't hesitate to contact Ocean Sonics. You can always leave us a message on any of our social channels. Dan and his team at FORCE can be found on their website at fundyforce.ca, or you can also find them on their social media channels. And in previous years, you've been able to visit them at their beautiful visitor center in Blackrock. It's due to the ongoing world climate right now. It is not open to the public, but perhaps keep your eyes out. It is a beautiful facility, and I do recommend anybody who gets the opportunity to visit them. And if you would like to revisit this presentation, it's going to be available on YouTube and on Facebook, and I will share the link through our social media channels later on. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we will see you next week for another live session. We'll see you then.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.